Hi and welcome. I'm Andi Mioč and you are watching Context. Paris is hosting the summit of the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Leaders gathered to go into detail on what kind of security they can provide Ukraine with if an eventual full ceasefire with Russia is agreed and comes into effect. Ahead of the meetup in the Élysée Palace, French President Emmanuel Macron hosted his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky and pledged 2 billion euros in additional military aid to Kyiv. The summit comes just days after the White House and the Kremlin announced they have reached a deal on a truce in the Black Sea. However, the Russian side has its demands, mainly lifting of sanctions on its agricultural trade and a return to the SWIFT international payment system. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is co-hosting the summit in Paris, accused the Russian President Vladimir Putin of making, quote, hollow promises on a ceasefire. What can the European-led coalition drum up in support of Ukraine? How much of an impact do the announced Washington-Moscow deals truly have? And is Russia about to find a way out of a tight spot when it comes to international sanctions? On all of this, we're talking to political analyst Abdunur Tumi, coming to us from Paris. Abdunur, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the talks themselves. Some 30 delegations from the EU and NATO, without the US, of course, are talking Ukraine's security. What can be expected here? Could the leaders perhaps come out with some specifics of the plan?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me on the show. And I mean, this process goes with, I mean, quote unquote, the leadership of Macron, who is taking this opportunity to appear, position himself on this new posture of the, the new imperative of geopolitics that has shifted, actually following the Russia special in Ukraine in 2022. And actually, very interesting because Prince Macron himself, I mean, at that time, he tried to play a role of a mediator between President Putin and President Zelensky, actually trying to re-implement the Minsk Accords, in which has become, at that time, already became an obsolete. So now the Europeans are in fact in the panic mood, particularly with the new administration in the US, and President Donald Trump has been very actually vocal and active to end this war. And following that, I mean, his words with actions to the to Riyadh's meeting. So on this, in this context, now the Europeans actually, Europeans are already actually were divided in aftermath of the Russian operation in 22, and now are trying to bring all Europe, actually New Europe and old Europe, what then U.S. Secretary of State Don Rumsfeld called it actually 2 decades ago in the rush to the Iraq invasion. So today, the meeting of this Coalition of the Willing Summit, and again, the Europeans are trying to again, stand to what's going on between Russia and the US, and this kind of rapprochement between Moscow and Washington, in which the Europeans felt are left out. So, but we saw the Europeans are trying to show their muscles and having or save what they can. Trying to save on the transatlantic relations with the Americans that has been going on for 8 decades. And all that economic and military and a strategic cooperation that was enhanced by then the Marshall Plan. Today, the Donald Trump, President Donald Trump administration is actually making all this into a new parameters. And actually, by the way, I mean, the speech of the American Vice President J.D. Vance in Munich Security Summit that has actually shocked the Europeans when they heard that there are, in fact, value differences between Europe and the U.S.
Well, now
So
that
all
you're
this
mentioning the
now,
Trump
President Macron
administration, we've heard Emmanuel Macron saying that European forces in Ukraine would be, quote, a card in the hand of Ukrainians. Some might say this is a clear reference to Donald Trump saying that without the US, Kiev has no cards. What could a European force accomplish if deployed on Ukrainian soil? Would European troops be enough of a deterrent for Russia?
Actually, I mean, this is, I mean, the point, and this is the dilemma of these talks between Moscow and Washington in Riyadh. And this is why, again, the Europeans are panicking because they don't know, I mean, what's going to come out from this discussion. I mean, they know there is like kind of vague I mean, vague impression that they're getting, but they're not, I mean, they don't know what they have to do because they are trying to have, and this is this meeting of today in Paris, and like that followed by the meeting of the more than 30 of military heads in Paris by President Macron. So to bring the Europeans and again to have kind of a voice to stand to the U.S. But in the end of the day, I mean, they can't because I mean, are limited because I mean to construct this or to have this or to put this in place, it needs at least I mean, according to the military expert, to 5 to 10 years. Now, as far as to put the boots on the ground or send the troops, it is again. I mean, they need a coherent policy because first of all, the EU, I mean, the 27 European countries are not I mean, on one voice on it. I mean, there are divisions between them, and we saw that how the position of Slovakia and Hungary, and so that Italy, so are not coherent like they were on their policy toward I mean, the war in Ukraine. At that time, the Biden and the American President Biden administration was, I mean, covering up this and taking the lead. Now, when President Donald Trump has shown another actually policy, and to some extent another doctrine dealing with this issue, so the Europeans now are trying to, again, I mean, they were shocked and are trying to recover from this shock and by building a kind of a common military or defense policy, like they call it. So this was actually, I mean, it's not new. I mean, this happened like 5 decades ago, and even before with, for instance, in France, when General de Gaulle at that time was trying to push the Europeans and Europeans in the NATO to distance themselves a little bit or to have kind of semi-autonomy from the US and have the European defense policy. And then later on, President Mitterrand, I mean, tried to do that with his counterpart, German counterpart, then Chancellor Koller, but it didn't work either. So now this time, so President Macron is trying to again position himself in these new geopolitics imperatives and geoeconomics as well, because all this was the result of the U.S. administration, the President Donald Trump administration, for again imposing all these commercial taxes on European products and so on. So again, and And President Macron himself, now he's weak because domestically he's weak because he's facing a serious political crisis, and he does. I mean, he lost. I mean, his credibility, and what I mean, this what is happening now on this deal or this rapprochement between Moscow and Washington, and discussion about peace process in Ukraine. He took this opportunity to again trying to bring or kind of rally around the flag effect.
Well,
But
let's talk about these
domestically,
direct US Russia deals for a second while Macron and Starmer are hosting the talks in Paris. On the ground, Moscow and Kyiv are accusing each other of breaking the previously agreed ceasefire regarding energy infrastructure. We obviously got the news from Washington and Moscow that another limited maritime truce is basically agreed upon. In your mind, will the Black Sea ceasefire be implemented, given that Russia is making some demands on sanctions relief?
this is very important. Actually, it's the key point in these discussions because again, Russia is counting on that. I mean, great deal, so that the Ukrainians. But in the end, I mean, Washington is trying to bring these two actually belligerent, I mean, to kind of reason points and have, I mean, start these negotiations and kind of break through to not actually directly, won't be automatically a peace deal, but at least truce or a ceasefire. Because, I mean, the energy issue is very, very, very important. And I mean, Europeans have suffered great deal from this. And this is why, I mean, again, for instance, France, Germany, I mean, their economy has suffered, and which is that led to again high inflation, and I mean pushing, for instance, France, I mean, to look for other partners in terms of gas providers from Russia. I mean, they were looking for, I mean, Qatar, Azerbaijan, and with Algeria too. And again, speaking about Algeria now, even President Macron, I mean, he is in his diplomatic crisis these days with Algeria. I mean, is not helping either. And so that the German, now the German with the new chancellor, Chancellor Merz, I mean, who is actually trying to stay away from or change totally the approach or that his predecessor has taken, and in fact is looking and bringing the new, I mean, new elements to this new Europe unity, and adding to that non-Europeans like Canada, for instance, on this matter. So now we saw this kind of access, I mean, is trying to be built between President Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Adding to that, I mean, in the coming days, the new German chancellor. But the question is, it's not about the leadership. Now it's about how to implement all this policy. I mean, on the ground. Knowing that, I mean, Europe is facing, as I stated, I mean, high inflation, and domestically, I mean, these main countries, I mean, France, Germany, and UK are also, I mean, their people are not happy about the economic policies and the high inflation and employment and so on. So, in the end of the day, now the Europeans are in fact obliged to follow up closely what's going on between Moscow and Washington. But in the end, I mean, they have to look at, I mean, to listen to Washington, because they are trying to dissociate themselves or trying to look for some autonomy, but the economic context and the geopolitical context are not in their favor.
Can Europeans in fact, or this coalition of the willing, step up and replace what Washington has been delivering mainly under the Biden administration? Because we all remember the very public spat of Trump and Vance on one side and Zelensky in the White House, then the pause in the military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Can this coalition replace the US?
And again, it's going to be very hard because, I mean, what Biden administration has been providing, I mean, was actually, and the UK, by the way, is Anglo-Saxon access who played a major part in this war. I mean, you stated it in terms of intelligence and military equipment, and even, again, injecting a lot of money. So the Europeans, like France and Germany, are not able right now, I mean, to do that. I mean, for instance, the public debt in France, I mean, has passed the 3 trillion. And people, I mean, domestically are not, again, happy about that. And also, the president himself, like, back to President Macron is weak. I mean, he's trying, again, to position himself on this circumstantial event that is taking place in Europe. But again, it's not going to last longer because, again, he has to deal with some domestic issues. As for Germany, it's the same. So the question here is, I mean, the European leaders who are not, and again, who are not coherent. I mean, we saw these differences between, as I said, between Hungary and Slovakia and Italy, and even in Spain. I mean, I mean, this morning, I mean, the prime minister, the Spanish prime minister, is trying to join this coalition, but he is facing also tough resistance domestically because I mean, practically like President Macron. I mean, he doesn't have a majority in the parliament. So this it takes time. And even if they try to do it, I mean, it's not going to be like a quick answer to the withdrawal of the President Trump administration from Ukraine. I mean, these military and logistic and finance and intelligence support. So
Well,
it
you
will
spoke
take
of
time.
the major
It's
players
right.
in the European Union. What of the Baltic states? What of Finland? What of Poland? The ones that are most concerned about Russia, let's say it like that. Warsaw is spending above 4% of GDP on defense. Could they maybe make a dent there?
I agree with that. I mean, the one who I concern directly, actually, Poland and the Baltic and Poland and the Baltic countries. I mean, like Finland, Sweden. I mean, actually, was one of the reasons. I mean, just following the Russia operation 2022. I mean, worked very hard. I mean, to join NATO, but this is again, it's still too early, I mean, to speak about how these countries will be affected. I'm sure, I mean, strategically speaking, the threat is there, but I don't think, I mean, the Russians, I mean, they will have this, I would say, appetite and to go after them one by one. And this is actually very interesting. This is the narrative is actually is now in the Western media, notably here in France. But and back to Poland, and Poland very interesting country because it's still, I mean, has risen its military GDP, and also is the main client, military client to Washington. So this is again brings us to the point of, first of all, I mean, the Europeans, they need to fix, I mean, their house and to have a coherent policy before they launch any, like, and I would say, I mean, to be more, to show this aggressiveness toward Russia, because The Russians, they know well, I mean, what's going on the field, and I mean, strategically, militarily, economically, and this is why, I mean, President Putin is not worried at all. I mean, President Putin's main concern is to reset the clock with the Americans, and again be a serious, like I mean, like Russia was, a serious world affairs play.
Well, Abdunur, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights and opinions.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's all we have for you in this edition of Context. Stay tuned to A News.